My text is blocked out pretty well now. Of course, there are probably going to be some adjustments I'm going to want to make, but I'm at least getting the layout to where I can make those adjustments and start to see the effects of the entire poster rather than individual pieces of text. The next thing I want to do is get my shapes on the page. And I want to make sure that I draw these to be geometrically precise. So I don't want to be trying to freehand these. In other words, I don't want to try to use tools in the software that's going to freehand these, because I want to choose the most iconic representation of each shape. So for example, the most iconic representation of a triangle is going to be one that has equal sides and equal angles all over, right? And the same thing for circle, it needs to be a perfect circle. Rectangles or squares, a square is probably going to be the best representation of those, and so on. So I want to make sure that these are geometrically correct and that they don't look stylized in any way, because that also would inject some meaning that I may or may not intend. The best way for me to do that is to rely very heavily on my shape tool here. So it by default represents as a rectangle, but if I click and hold on that, any of these tools that have a little arrow that points out means that these are actually a drawer and there are more than one tool in there. So if I click that, I can see that I can choose a rectangle, an ellipse, a polygon, a star, and even a line segment, and start to create those. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is the rectangle. And the next thing I'm going to want to do is probably determine some sort of consistent factor between these. And I have a little bit more space horizontally than I do vertically. So I'm probably going to want to make sure that all these shapes are the same height so that they fit onto the space well. But really, if I can get them close, to the same width as well, I just want to keep them in proportion in some way. So for me, I'm going to make sure that I standardize their height, and I'm going to work from there. So the first thing I'm going to do is select my shape tool, and I'm going to choose rectangle. I'm going to double click on the pasteboard, and I'm going to create a perfect square. So I don't have to constrain proportions for this. I just need to choose a size. Now I know that this is about 2.5 inches wide because I set that up, which means that if I compare that, these shapes would probably look good at around 1.5 inches tall, or perhaps maybe even smaller, like 1.25, right? So I'm going to go 1.5 for both sides of my square, or both dimensions of my square, and see how that looks. That actually looks a little big for this space, but I can figure that out again by using my alignment and distribution tools. So with my square selected, if I hold down Shift and select the text box that describes it, and then if I let go of Shift and select this text box again, I can use my alignment tool to align the square right in the center of that. And now I need to deselect just the text box. So I'm going to hold down Shift and click it again to where now the square is the only thing I've got selected. I'm going to click and hold, and I'm going to hold down Shift so that it doesn't move side to side. And I'm going to pull it up to where it's just a little bit taller than the text box, or where it's positioned higher than the text box. Now I can select with Shift my text box again. And again, I need to select it as a key object. So I need to release Shift and select it one more time. And now I just want to put a consistent amount of space in between the top of my text box and the bottom of my shape. To do that, I'm going to use this distribute spacing tool. And as long as I have two boxes selected, I can type any number that I want in here, and it's going to put that amount of space in there between the edges of them. And so in this case, let's see, probably about 1/8 of an inch is about the most room I have. So I'm going to type in 0.125. And then with that value typed in, if I click this button, it's going to vertically distribute that space. You can see it moved it down. And I can see that sure enough, this is still just a little bit too big. So what I want to do is I want to resize my square, but I don't want to repeat any of the efforts I just made to get it into position. So I'm going to select my square. And then I'm going to come to my transform panel, and I'm going to change my reference point to the bottom center, because this text is centered on this paragraph, and the most important side as far as its positioning is its bottom, because the bottom is exactly spaced off the top of the text box. So if I make this the bottom center, then I can change my width and my height, and this point will remain fixed and everything will move towards it when I resize. So the 1.5 is just a little bit too big. I'm going to go for 1 1/4. I'll type 1.25 for both of them. And that's a little bit better. It's still a little bit tight, and I'm probably going to want to make some adjustments after I get everything in place. But this at least gives enough breathing room between the paragraph above it and the space here to where I can align those well. So the next thing I want to do is create another one of my shapes. So I'm going to take my shape tool, and this time I'm going to choose the ellipse. I'm going to double click, and I'm going to keep that consistent height. So this time I'm going to make a circle that is 1.25 inches tall and wide. And click OK. And now again, I can get this into position the same way I did the square. One thing that I may want to do is just make sure that this is sitting kind of above the text so that I can use the distribute spacing tool more easily. But if I select my shape and my text box, holding down Shift, and then if I release Shift and select my text box as my key object, I can now come to my alignment panel. I can center them horizontally, and this value for distribute spacing is going to remain constant until I change it. So now I don't even have to type the value in anymore. I just need to make sure that the shape is positioned above the text box, and I can just click distribute spacing, and it comes in just like it should. I could also have aligned it along the bottom of the other shape if I wanted to. So now these are starting to fall into place fairly well. So I'm going to come back now, and I'm going to spend some time with my polygon tool, because a lot of the shapes that are on here are polygons. So I'm going to choose my polygon tool, and I'm first going to choose a 3-sided polygon to make a triangle. And now this one's asking me for the radius of the polygon. So I am going to type in 1.25 divided by 2, though. So that would need to be, what's that? A half plus an eighth. Well, a half would be 4/8, and then 1 more eighth would be 5/8. Instead of having to get out a calculator, I could just type 5/8, and it will convert it for me, and I can click OK. That looks a little small compared to the others, but we'll see how things work out. So now with it selected, I'm going to hold down Shift, select the text box that's associated with it, let go of Shift, and select the text box one more time to make it a key object. Then I'm going to center it, and then I'm going to distribute that spacing so that it sits down where it should. Now I can see it should be bigger, right? It's not quite tall enough. So I'm going to select my triangle, and then I'm going to come to my transform panel. Keeping my reference point at the bottom center, I can see that the width and the height is a lot less than 1 1/4 inches, and I can see that the width is actually just a little bit wider than the height. So what I'm going to do is, in this case, I'm actually going to click my Constrain Proportions button on so that the width and the height change together. And I'm going to make the height, because that's what I wanted to be consistent, 1 1/4 inches. And when I do that, the sides are going to size up in a way that's in proportion, and that looks a little bit better across the board. So we have a couple more polygons to create. We can do the same thing. They're all going to ask for radius, so we're going to probably need to go back to each one and transform as well. But what I'm going to do is pause the video, and I'm going to create my pentagon, my hexagon, and my octagon down here. And so I want you to work along, pause the video, and create those, and go ahead and get them into position. And then we'll talk about some of the more irregular shapes when we get back. Got my polygons all positioned now, and I'm ready to start creating some of the more irregular shapes that I need to create in here, or some of the ones that are a little bit more challenging. But one thing I want to do before I get too much further is save my work. I think we're all pretty well used to softwares that autosave, and Adobe products don't. So I am going to also start committing to memory the Command S keystroke command, which is save. And I'm going to hit Command and S. And since I haven't saved yet, it's going to open up the Save As dialog instead, and it wants to know if I want to save this to Creative Cloud or if I want to save it on my computer. I'm going to save mine on my computer, but it depends on where you're working. You know, it might make more sense to save it to the cloud if you're going to be moving between machines. I'm going to choose Save on my computer, and I'm going to come and find my Documents folder, And I do want to have some decent file management here. So what I would recommend you do is to have a folder for this class. I've got one called GRD152. I'm going to create a new folder called P1, if I don't already have one by that name. And then I'm going to create a folder inside that folder called E1 for exercise 1, because I know I'm going to have at least one more exercise. I'm going to save my file in there. It's asking me what options as far as compatibility. It's a good idea to look over all of these dialog boxes. I think we're so used to just dismissing them that we forget they've got information we might need in there. And so far all of this looks fine. So I'm going to click OK. And now I'll be able to save as I go. But I do need to create some of these other shapes here. So I've got the horizontal and vertical lines to create, the star, and then a heart, diamond, and spiral. The easiest one's going to be the star, because there's a tool for that. So I'm going to come to my polygon tool, select star tool, double click on the pasteboard, and it's asking me how many points I want. And then this gets tricky because it asks for radius 1 and radius 2. So how much space should be in between the interior points of the star, or the pieces that are cutting away from the shape, as well as the points that are extending outward. Now I'm going to keep it to this default size. I'm not going to change anything unless I have to, but it's good to know that you would use this star tool if you were going to create a badge or a certificate that was a circle that had many points. So you might end up creating a star with 100 points and very shallow radius for each one of those values, so that it looks like, you know, the badge that you can get on a certificate or something like that. I'm just going to try it with its default, and it gives me a pretty decent star. The star is pointing downward, which obviously carries meaning with it, as well as pointing upward. I think it makes more sense for it to point upward, so I am going to rotate that until it points upward. Notice with it selected as the polygon, I have the choice to rotate if I get close to one of the corners. So I'm just going to choose to rotate. I'm going to hold down Shift and see if I can get it pointing straight up and down, and that worked. Then with that selected, I'm going to select my text box about the star by holding down Shift. Then I'm going to let go of Shift and make star text box my key object. Come back to my alignment tools. I'm going to center align horizontally and then vertical distribute so that it's in place that it should be. And that moves through fairly quickly. I do want you to notice as we're moving through, like these shapes that take up more of that available space, like if we considered this square to be kind of the medium and we were cutting parts away to make each of these shapes, each of these take up a lot more space than the star. The star looks kind of small, even though we know it's the right size, it looks kind of small by comparison. Let's check. I'm going to come to my transform. And actually, it's a little bit taller than the others. They're each 1.25 inches tall, and this one has just a little bit more than that. For now, I'm going to make it technically correct, but at some point I'm going to want to consider making it optically correct so that it looks right instead of it being technically correct and looking smaller, because that also suggests hierarchy, and that suggests that the star is maybe not as important as the octagon, for example. Now that I've got it set up, I'm going to do another Command S to save. And then I can continue on with some of my shapes. Now, for my diamond, that might be the next easiest thing for me to make, because in this case, I'm probably not going to want to create a diamond that is the shape of a gem. I'm going to want to create a diamond that's more of a parallelogram, but I also don't really want it to be a square that's rotated at 45 degrees, because that really means something different, right? That's a square that's balancing on its point as opposed to a diamond shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my triangle here, and I'm going to copy it. And then I'm going to move over to the pasteboard. I'm going to Command V to paste. And I'm just going to move this off of the poster for a little bit. And I'm going to zoom in. And I'm going to take this same triangle and I'm going to copy it again. So I'm going to Command C. But this time I'm not going to Command V, because that's going to paste it somewhere arbitrarily. I could, and I could use my alignment tools. But what I'm going to do instead is Command F, which is paste in front. And I'm going to create a second triangle, and you can see if I move it, it's a second triangle right on top of the first triangle. And then I'm going to come to what is by default my rotate tool. And I'm going to use my reflect tool within that drawer instead. This little cyan crosshair is the reference point that it's going to rotate on. So what I really want to do is try to get that on that bottom edge. My snaps are on, so it's snapping right to the bottom of the shape. And now if I reflect and I hold down Shift, I just click and drag somewhere in the artboard. And I can see that they appear to be aligned right. The most important part is that they're right up against each other and that there's no overlap. What I can do to make sure they're centered, select them both, choose one as a key object, and just make sure that they're aligned on center. And they are. So now what I want to do is just not leave these as two separate triangles. I want to combine these into a diamond. So I'm going to select both. And I'm going to use some new tools now. I'm going to use another tab that's grouped together with my Align and Transform panels called the Pathfinder. I'm going to come to the Pathfinder and I'm just going to choose Unite. When I do that, you notice that line that divided the two of them disappeared. And now this is treated as a single shape. So I've actually made it a diamond and not two triangles that are stacked on top of one another. I need to make it a little smaller because it's a little too tall. But then I need to decide for myself too if I want this diamond to be taller than it is wide or wider than it is tall. And in this case, given that I have more space for the width, I think I'm actually going to rotate this. I'm going to hold down Shift when I do it so it stays, straight side to side. And then I'm going to see what happens if I come to my Transform panel and I make the height 1.25 inches with it sitting on its side. I think that will look better because I think it'll be too small if I leave it pointing straight up and down. But now with it selected, we can continue with our review. I hold down Shift to select the text box. Release Shift, select the text box again, align on center, and distribute, and now my diamond is in place as well. So now I just have a couple more of the more irregular shapes to create, including the heart, and then just creating some vertical and horizontal lines. Since this video has gotten a little long, I'm going to do those in a separate video, but we'll cover how to do them